thing on? Is this thing on? Okay. Hey, fifth time's the charm. Let's hope we're not distorting now. Darn Mercury retrograde, right? So, welcome. Welcome back to Graybeard Astrology. I'm Jim. How you doing in YouTube land there? You know, some classic Mercury issues. My audio is giving me a little grief here. Always want to have really good audio on YouTube. My levels were all screwed up and I didn't move anything. I don't know. Must have been the gremlins overnight. Anywho, welcome to the channel today. So we've discussed the Thema Mundi in the past couple videos, or a couple videos ago, I should say. So now today is kind of like the part 2 of that, where I'm going to discuss the Planetary Joys, kind of break down, there's a difference between Celestial Joy and Terrestrial Joy. It's a difference between the planets rejoicing in a particular house and then planets rejoicing in a particular hemisphere, the upper hemisphere, the lower hemisphere, so to speak, and then planets rejoicing in a sign. That's kind of what we're talking about today. Feel free to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. If you got any comments or, anything you want to share and stuff, feel free to leave a comment below. Always nice. I'm still obviously beginning kind of, my channel is still, very relatively new and stuff. So any engagement is always appreciated and helpful. You know how that goes in YouTube land, right, people? Anywho, if you want to just go ahead to the other section of the video and stuff, I'll put some timestamps below. Going forward for the channel, I just covered James Hetfield's chart, the last video and stuff, and I want to go through Cliff Burton's chart eventually, and Nikki Sixx, like I mentioned before, and maybe some other musicians and stuff. And then going forward after that, we're going to get into the dignities, all the different kinds of dignities and stuff, which I find really fun. And then I'm sure I've got a whole list of other videos that I can't think of right now. Maybe even, start talking about real-time movement and stuff. I've been kind of holding off on that. I know that there's, there's so many astrology channels out there where everybody's, kind of doing forecast videos for all 12 signs and stuff. And I've actually, kind of on purpose, haven't done that, on purpose. Just because this is what everybody's doing. Probably is what everybody, the customer probably, the viewer probably wants, But I haven't done that. Maybe I will start doing that. I don't know. But, I've been working on my classes at Kepler College. So I've been doing the math class now where you got to go through and, construct a chart by hand doing all the math. So it's really, really interesting. And then I completed the chart rectification class a couple months ago. So that was really interesting. It was a quick, 5-week class. Doing the chart calculation class, that's 10 weeks, and I'm kind of right in the middle of it now. So it's really, it takes a lot of time and everything like that, but fascinating. I can't wait to get past these couple classes, and then I could start taking stuff that's a little bit more interesting. I've got to take the history class. I'm looking forward to that one. Baby steps, getting through all the classes and stuff. So that's always fun to make progress there. We'll go ahead now and get into the slides for today. Enjoy. So I want to kind of reiterate something else I've probably talked about in another video, but what we're talking about here with traditional astrology is everything begins with the rising sign of the horoscope, if you will. It's so important to understand. It's important to understand that the sign on the eastern horizon at the moment of birth is the most personal point in the chart. What's referred to as the ascendant or the rising sign or the ascendant degree. So that is the degree coming over the eastern horizon at the moment of first breath, if you will. And it's just extremely important because by whatever that sign might be, it dictates the rest of the locations of the signs or places in the astrology chart, especially if we're using whole sign houses, which is the kind of the oldest traditional way of doing it. And I'm not against using quadrant houses, but I like using both. You look at the whatever your quadrant house choice might be, or using whole sign. I like to look at both of them, and depending upon the technique, and to look at both of them to see what might drastically change using different house systems, or comparatively to the whole sign. Normally, kind of often, if you have a very late degree in a sign for the ascendant, well, that will really drastically change the quadrant house chart from the whole sign chart. You know, that's usually when it really sees a drastic variance. But anyway, so the ancient Greeks called this type of astrology horoscopic astrology, which horoscopus, I think I'm saying that correct. I hope I'm saying that correctly. The word means our marker or our watcher, and from this word, we get the modern term of horoscope. And I've always found that just fascinating, and I like to tell the definition or talk about this as often as I can, and I just love it. So when we're talking about the astrology chart, we're talking about the horoscopic chart, which means focusing on that hour marker, creating the rising sign. It was a system that was built around the ascendant as the primary anchor of the chart. It marks the beginning of the first house and sets the entire wheel in motion. So this was developed. The development of the horoscopic astrology, it happened way back in the Hellenistic Egyptian times, particularly in Alexandria, where the Babylonians and mixed with the Egyptians and the Greek traditions, they all blended together, and they kind of came up with what we consider as Western astrology right now, or horoscopic astrology, which means our marker, our watcher, which means defining the ascendant and allowing the rest of the signs to fall into the places. So we take the hour marker, and that dictates where the other signs are going to fall in the places, or the houses, if you will. So the great astronomer and astrologer Claudius Ptolemy, 2nd century CE, his very influential work in the Tetrabiblos, it helped codify and preserve many of these techniques, and he's like, kind of the godfather of it all. Now, technically, Ptolemy was more of kind of like in his day, he was like the jack of all trades scientist. Ptolemy really necessarily, I've read, how do I know, right? How do I know? I've read it, that he really wasn't particularly a practicing astrologer. He was more of a scientist of his time, and he formulated his own hypothesis, and he worked out astrology just as a experiment, kind of, sort of, to prove yes or no in his opinion. And his work is some of the best kind of reference, or textbooky kind of stuff that we have, or at least it's been passed down, and it's actually, like, I want to say that it's like most preserved, the joys of the planet, which is what this video is about. But I felt the really need to kind of reiterate that ascendant sign, or the hour markers, is really being important, in the sense that it kind of dictates where all the other signs fall into the places, because there's a difference between a planet in a sign and a planet in a house. There's a difference between the two. And as anybody that's listened to me before, we do not conflate the definitions of signs with the definition of houses. They're not. There sometimes there are affinities, and sometimes there's, similarities, but we're not confusing sign explanations with house explanations. And we're not going to explain Uranus by talking about the 11th house. And we're not going to talk about the 10th house and explain stuff about Capricorn. All right. I'm getting off my soapbox now. All right. Okay, so we have terrestrial and celestial joys. So in traditional astrology, the concept of planetary joys is divided into two kind of complementary layers, if you will. I say that too much, eh? We got to start editing the if you will. It's a one-sided conversation I'm having here, so it's kind of hard to... If there was somebody just to go nod their head and stuff, like they understand, I wouldn't repeat my little sentences, my little phrases so often. Anywho, so they're divided into two beautiful and complementary layers. There is terrestrial joy, and then there is celestial joy. Together they show us where planets feel most at home and function most effectively. Terrestrial joy refers to specific houses where each planet naturally rejoices. These house placements are considered a form of accidental dignity, strength that comes from the planet's position and circumstance in the chart. Let me say that again. This strength comes from the planet's position and circumstance in the natal chart. When a planet is in its terrestrial joy, it finds itself in an ideal environment and can express its nature more smoothly, powerfully, and enjoyably. And for the most part, that's what the planets are trying to do. They're trying to express themselves in the chart. The problem is sometimes they're in a sign or a house that isn't the greatest, and so that expression is frustrated. And that's how we get life problems, situations. Planets in their terrestrial joy function more smoothly, powerfully, and enjoyably. So in this slide here, we have a map here showing the house. Well, we're going to go over the house kind of topics. I've got a slide here that kind of shows you the overview of the houses that the 7 traditional planets prefer to be in. The terrestrial joys, mapping the house topics. House topics are not random. They derive directly from the Sect logic in the Thema Mundi. So Mercury finds its joy in the first house, the helm, the body, health, identity, beginnings. Mercury here acts as a bridge between the dark of night and the light of the day. Mercury finds its joy here because it's in the native, it's in the first house representing the native. Mercury's inquisitive, he's curious, he's active. And in the first house, Mercury can do all the things he likes to do because he's in the house of the essence of the body and as the essence of the individual, the first house. So it's a place that he quite enjoys being. And that is kind of where they get the phrase, the joys of the planets, you know. It's intuitive, it's the body, it's the self. Mercury is the cognitive mind. It's always searching for more input and data, as well as trying to share data and talk and stuff. And, think of a incredibly clever or a person that's very good at expressing themselves, or maybe kind of annoying and neurotic, where they might not stop chatting up, but they're enjoying the hell out of themselves, So that's one take. So next we get to the moon, and the moon takes its joy in the third house, which is a Caden house. The third house is called the goddess, or the house of the goddess, where the moon finds its joy. It is the moon is the planet of the evening, the sun of the evening, if you will, the goddess of the night. The third house is kind of falls under short journeys, learning, education, early education, the local environment, competition, and siblings. That's why competition and competitiveness fall under the third house. And that's because it's of its connections with siblings and how siblings have to kind of wrestle wrestle for attention, wrestle each other for, kind of dominance over each other. There's squabbles and stuff like that that kids do as they're growing up, or even as they get older with siblings, But the moon finds its joy here because it's, it's around the family. It's the immediate environment. If you think of what's around you, or what might have been around you in ancient times, at nighttime when, dusk, after dinner, dusk, almost bedtime, it's the immediate family network. And that's why the moon finds its joy here. Yeah. It's also, I should say it is the house of the goddess. So where the ninth house is more there's a higher knowledge, religion, philosophy is the ninth house. The third house is kind of more everyday activities or rituals, and that's another reason the third house has the name of a goddess, or the joy of the moon, is because that is a more everyday function that we do, or a more consistent function of rituals, albeit, whether they're just daily activities or more, spiritual based stuff that, like, if we went to church once a week, it's a ritual, as opposed to the ninth house, which is more like, this is my religion, this is the spiritual practice I have, and this is its philosophy. The third house is the ritual of doing that activity. So that's another reason why it's the goddess. It would be the goddess house, or place would be the proper way to say that. So next is the fifth house, the joy of Venus, pleasure, creativity, love, children, romance, and joyful expression. Everything that Venus kind of stands for kind of falls into that fifth house. Now, we could take that off the deep end and, overdo it, overindulge. Venus and Jupiter are the benefics, but you can go overboard and indulge too much. So overdoing it with pleasure, overdoing with drugs and alcohol, overdoing it with gambling, because the fifth house is the house of gambling. So any of those could be overdone. But that's why Venus is getting its joy here. It's nothing but pleasure and joyful self-expression. So it can be music or creativity of all kinds and stuff. But now Venus is more of a material sensation kind of thing. Where Jupiter is like wisdom, abundance, growth, expansion, honor, truth, right? Venus is more about chocolate, good food, good entertainment. It's more tangible, a little bit more material, a little bit maybe even more vain, maybe even more, sugary, that kind of thing. So what the fifth house is referred to is more material. So the another name for the fifth house is the house of good fortune. So it would be more on a material plane, what befalls you. So the 11th house is the joy of Jupiter, which I haven't got to yet. But the 11th house is associated with a phrase used to describe the 11th house is the house of good spirits. And by that it means other people, associates, friends, networking. And it kind of goes hand in hand with the idea of Jupiter finding its joy in the 11th house. So now if we kind of look at the opposite of that, as opposed to outside of the person, networking and stuff in the 11th house, in the 5th house, Venus finds its joy. So this is more personal, creativity, children, romance, joyful expression, gambling, more material, sensational kind of for the native, or an expression of their creativity where, the 5th house is children's. It's an offshoot of creativity, the ultimate creativity, right? And that's why Venus finds its joy in this 5th house. It's more of a personal house, and it is below the horizon, so it's more on the physical material plane as opposed to above the horizon, which would be a more social, spiritual place. Below the horizon is more material. Now we come to the 6th house, and all of these houses, much like any explanation of the houses, the polar opposite house almost helps explain whichever house you're talking about by having the polarity there. So now the 6th house is the house of bad fortune. If the 5th house was the house of good fortune, I don't know, did I miss saying that? Because the 11th house was the house of good spirits. The 5th house is the house of good fortune, where the idea of the lot of fortune comes from. But I'm getting ahead of myself there too. So now we get to the 6th house, which is the house of bad fortune. And we find who else but the planet Mars finding its joy in the 6th house. Often referred to as the house of bad fortune or the house of illness or injury and service. Daily work, subordination. Even Mars works more constructively here. So Mars finds its joy in this house of physical, physical activity or, service, subordination. So it's the house of the grind. It's the daily grind that we, have. It's your job. It's, having to do the chores of the daily or your weekly monotonous grind, if you will. But Mars finds its joy here. Now, think of this as Mars is like picture, ancient times or some, military force. So the soldier is represented by Mars. The generals or the king or whoever might be, they're represented by, Jupiter, Saturn, the sun, those are the generals, right? But Mars is kind of your schmuck, soldier, and he is doing a service for his country, for his band, for his group, for his people, right? He's doing he's sacrificing himself for that service, and but he's not necessarily in charge, right? The other guys are in charge, and that's the subordination understanding of the sixth house, and why Mars finds its joy here is because it's bad luck. I mean, Mars is a malefic. Illness, toil, hard work, burden. That's why Mars likes that house. Now you can't spin it around and kind of try to put a happy face on it. There's people with really, put a really good, a well-placed Mars in its joy in the sixth house, ruling, let's say, for example, the first house. And you could have somebody that's really into fitness or a really good soldier, So, as much as it might take a toll on their body, but, it might work out for them, That would be an expression of, mitigation, We get to the ninth house where the sun finds its joy in the ninth house. And the ninth house was referred to as God. It was so if the third house is the goddess, the ninth house was referred to as the God house, where the sun finds its joy because the sun is the king, or however you might say that. The sun is the god of the daytime, higher knowledge, philosophy, long, more of like religious. Let's say what do you say? That taking a long religious journey, a pilgrimage, right? So the third house, short local travel. We have, ritual, third house. But now the ninth house, the sun finds its joy here because it's taking like a once in a lifetime religious pilgrimage to some distant land. And what I've read is that the ancients, the old guys, when they talked about distant travel, it always included a boat or a ship. It always included a voyage. That's what they consider distant travel, always getting in a boat. Anyway, but, hair to split. Higher knowledge, philosophy, long distance travel, or religious, pilgrimage, divine matters, authority, volatility, and stuff. So the ninth house, and, we've been talking. So the ninth house, the sixth house, the third house, these are all cadent houses. So they're not necessarily, very powerful houses as far as angularity is concerned. They're all cadent houses. But yet these particular planets find their joys there. It's kind of fascinating. So the sun finding its joy in the ninth house is like, it's not quite like the politician or, the president or the king would be the 10th house, right? but his advisors, the board, the chairman of the board, that's the ninth house. So it's like not necessarily in that leadership position of the strength of the 10th house, but it's very strong, like the Consulari, La Costa Nostra, Consulari, that would be the ninth house, the joy of the sun. Yeah. So now we get to the 11th house and the planet Jupiter. The 11th house is called the house of good spirits, and that's why Jupiter gets its joy here. Good spirits, networking, friendships, groups, alliances, and aspirations for hopes of the future, paying it forward, and, plans for your future and stuff, like, to-do lists and long-term goals kind of thing. And that's why Jupiter finds its joy here, is because it's fellowship with other people, and it's about expanding your network, if you will, and it's about planning, and things like this. Hopes and wishes and alliances for the future. The fortune from others. There you go. Now, jumping back to that 5th house and the house of good fortune. So this is the house of fortune from others, hopes and wishes, groups, friends, and alliances, positive wishes for the future. So now we get to the other fun one. So the 12th house was referred to as the house of bad spirits. So going back to the 6th house, which Mars, found its joy in the house. So I've got to repeat myself just to keep it straight in my head. The 5th house is the house of good fortune. The 6th house, the house of bad fortune. The 11th house, the house of good spirits. The 12th house, the house of bad spirits. So it's more on a, social kind of ish level. Confinement, loss, hidden enemies, institutions, deep karmic work. Now Saturn finds its joy here because everything I just kind of listed is kind of what Saturn kind of digs, loss, confinement, restriction, isolation, sorrow. Those are all kind of things that kind of follow, that Saturn kind of digs, Saturn is the greater malefic, restrictions, limitations. Saturn fits the shadowy, challenging nature of this house, and that's why he finds his joy there. If people can't follow whatever society's rules are, they end up in a confinement, and it's limiting their mobility, their ability and stuff. And especially in the older traditions, they equated it with prisons and stuff, but also monasteries. And that's where the 12th house gets some, where it gets its religious or spiritual undertones. A lot of people explain it as a house of taking a sabbatical, or taking some time off. But the old guys, or the ancients, it was where the monks would go to live in isolation. A nun would go to a convent. That's the word I was looking for. So, and then like institutions, hospitals, even government institutions, universities, hospitals. Those are all institutions. And think of, and that's the other reason that Saturn gets its joy here. Bad spirits, The bad spirits, is the self-undoing of yourself. The bad spirits, the bad spirits in your head, hidden enemies, and this, hidden because it's, you can't see the 12th house from the 1st house. So it's hidden there. And these are the hidden enemies are the kind of people that are going to they don't like you, but they're not going to confront you about it. You're looking right at them and not knowing that they're not having your best interest. As opposed to the 7th house, which would be like an open enemy. Now, I've even heard that the 6th house is open enemies too. And, it's on the other side of the chart. But the 12th house would be a hidden enemy. Somebody you don't know doesn't like you. An institution with not your, greatest interests in mind, if you will, So these aren't soft or gentle topics. These are stark, real domains of our, human life. Even the malefics, Mars and Saturn, cause less harm and function. Okay, even the malefics, they function better in these houses. They have more purpose when they are in their terrestrial joys. Now, the sign that they might fall in because of, the nature of that sign might help or hinder, that planet in that house. But generically speaking, it is a mitigation of having, a certain planet in a certain house, kind of mitigates that planet a little bit. But now if the planet is not in rulership or exaltation, generically speaking, the thing is that it's going to pull the rulers. So wherever the ruler, okay, I'm getting my head of myself and I don't want to confuse you, right? But let's say you have Mars, let's say you have one of the malefics in a house that it's finding its joy in. So we think of the malefics, Mars and Saturn. So you have Mars or Saturn in the 6th house or in the 12th house for Saturn, right? But now the sign that it's in is going to dictate if it has any dignity, whether it's rulership or exaltation, first and foremost. But now if it doesn't have dignity because it's not in a sign of its rulership or exaltation, the reason it's going to cause problems is that the ruler is going to be somewhere else and it's going to be dragged into that subject where the malefic is. That's kind of the reason it's going to cause the grief, is because it's going to drag the other planet's interest into that house. I hope that makes sense. And having said that, it's always, all these explanations are generic because every chart is unique. I hope that makes sense. So even the malefics, they cause less harm. They function a little bit more purposely. They're able to channel their difficult energy in a more constructive way. These terrestrial joys, they're not random. They derive directly from the ancient Thema Mundi, the mythical birth chart of the world, which encodes the foundational logic of Sect that runs through the entire system. So now we're going to move. I'm going to bring up this chart here, the macro cosmic law of the Thema Mundi. So the geometry of the joys perfectly mirrors the Thema Mundi, the mythical birth chart of the universe. So now we've got a slide up here that shows the planets in their joys. And what you can also notice is that we have the aspects, more the positive or negative aspects, and you can see how they make hard aspects or positive aspects to the benefics and or malefics. It's just so fascinating. And after you're going through the Thema Mundi, and now we're going through the Planetary Joys, everything just falls into place. And this is just, it's the symmetry and it's just so fascinating. So now we can see that we've just covered, the sun, for example. It makes a sextile to Jupiter, but it makes a square to Saturn. The sun in the 9th house, in its joy, makes a square to Saturn in the 12th house of its joy. The sun. So, but now that's only looking at the chart from from the top hemisphere or the southern hemisphere. Now, if we look at the bottom hemisphere, the moon, the luminary of the northern part of the chart, makes a hard aspect to the malefic Mars and a sextile to Venus, which mirrors what the sun was doing on the other side of the chart. And then if we look at Mercury, the great bridge, he's making a sextile to the moon, a trine to the sun, a sextile to Jupiter, and a trine to Venus. All beautiful aspects. And Mercury makes no contact with the malefics in this position, in this theoretical chart. The malefics are averse to the first house. Fantastic. So now let's look at what we call the Celestial Joys, which brings us into one of the most important and nuanced concepts of traditional astrology, which is Sect. And that's, I was saying in the other video too, how all these things are such an onion. All these rules and things are lessons, are onions, and one leads into the other. So we talk about primary direction, and we're talking about this, and then we're talking about the joys of the planets, and now we're talking about sect again. So sect, from the Greek word heresis, meaning fraction or team. It divides the entire cosmos, the chart, and the planets into diurnal or nocturnal groups. We've covered this already, but we're just going to run through it again. The diurnal sect, or the day team, is the Sun, Jupiter, and Saturn. The nocturnal sect, or the night team, is the Moon, Venus, and Mars. Now, Mercury is flexible and can join either team depending upon its natal position. A chart is diurnal, or a day chart, when the sun is above the horizon, somewhere between the 7th and the 12th house. A nocturnal chart is when the sun is below the horizon, somewhere in the 1st or the 6th house. Now, the celestial joys are expressed through sect in several ways. The diurnal planets prefer to be on the southern hemisphere, or the upper portion of the chart, which is the southern hemisphere, which is the most public and visible part of the chart. The nocturnal planets prefer to be on the lower hemisphere, or the more private internal part of the chart. Diurnal planets generally prefer to be in masculine signs, and nocturnal planets prefer to be in feminine signs, or receptive signs. Let's say masculine is more assertive, feminine more receptive. So this is why the terrestrial joys line up so fantastically with the sect and the diurnal planets. Jupiter, Saturn all rejoice in houses that are in the upper houses, or the southern hemisphere of the chart, while the nocturnal planets, the Moon, Venus, and Mars, all find their rejoicing houses in the lower half of the chart, or the northern hemisphere of the chart. And Mercury is the bridge, sitting in the first house position. The planet functions best when the planets overall function best when their inherent nature aligns with both the chart sect and the sign's diurnal or nocturnal quality. A planet that is in its terrestrial joy and supported by sect becomes significantly stronger and more effective. So what they're saying is that any particular planet is going to have a rejoicing. It's like little notches of good luck, bad luck kind of thing. And, there's all these little checks that we do. So is the planet in the hemisphere it likes to be in? Is the planet in a sign it likes to be in? Is a planet in the quadrant it likes to be in? These are all what's called rejoicing qualities. And it's not the end of the world. It's just like a mitigation of, let's say you have, what looks like a difficult situation for a planet. There's these mitigating facts. With traditional astrology, we're always assessing the planets, or the strength of the planet. Weighing the planet's ability to express itself or to fulfill its kind of mission, so to speak, and or the difficulty it has with it. So by judging and weighing and examining these mitigating factors of the planets, you're really, trying to come to a conclusion of how hard does this planet, how much does the individual have to work? You can have planets in a house that they might like to be in, which would be their joy. But if it's in a sign that doesn't match the sect of the chart, it's going to be, kind of hard for that planet to express itself. For example, you could have the sun in the 9th house in a day chart, but the sun happens to fall into a more receptive sign or a nocturnal sign. Therefore, that sun isn't going to want to express itself as assertively as it would in an assertive sign, right? So it's kind of like not in its favor of its ability to get out there and do it, Or, for example, you have the moon, maybe, let's say it's in the upper part of the chart or the southern hemisphere. The moon doesn't want to be there. Let's say the moon's in a masculine assertive sign. It wants to be below the horizon in a more passive sign. That's how it wants to express itself. Those are kind of the ways to use these lessons or understandings is weighing how happy the planets are. Terrestrial joy equals houses-based accidental dignity or placement strength. Now, we didn't really talk about angularity because with all these joys of the planets, the only one in an angular house is Mercury. Mars, let's see, the moon, Mars, Saturn, and the sun are all in cadent houses. And then the two benefics are in succeeding houses, which is kind of nice. It's kind of interesting. I'm sure there's a theory on this, but I don't have it off the top of my head. Accidental dignity or placement strength is more of terrestrial joy. Celestial joy is more sect-based dignity, which blends the essential dignities through the sign's polarities and accidental dignities through hemisphere and chart type. The two layers work together as a unified symmetrical system, which is why some planetary placements just feel more smooth or more natural to the native. It is one of the most elegant frameworks in the traditional astrology system, a perfect marriage of earthly houses and heavenly order. Okay, so I thought that would be a good place to stop for today. I hope you enjoyed. I hope I was able to articulate and explain things clearly and stuff. Maybe not fantastically, but at least kind of clearly, And there's a cool slide here I wanted to bring up. It's kind of the architecture of the aspects. So it goes through the planets and their Chaldean order. It's kind of a good screenshot to take. Goes through the planets themselves and their Chaldean order based on speed. And then the nocturnal sign associated with the planet. The diurnal sign associated with the planet. And then some geometric aspects. And then the nature of the aspect. So it's kind of interesting because once you start learning about the planets and then you start trying to understand aspects, well, you just have to remember which planet that aspect is associated with, and it kind of gets you halfway there, If you saw a square in a chart, you would know the squares in the nature of Mars. That's all I'm trying to say. So it's nice to kind of have this architecture, if you will, on this little screenshot, Hope you enjoyed the video and stuff. If you have any comments or anything, feel free to leave them below. If you want to hit the subscribe button or click the thumbs up button, I'd really appreciate it. Have a good one. I'm Jim. It's Graybeard Astrology. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.